Hi, this is David Steinberg. I have a show on called Inside Comedy on Showtime in the States, and I'm on ShowbizMonkeys.com.
Around this town, I'm alright. Around this town, I'm alright. I mean, no consequence when you playing with the fire. Move to the left, man. No fuss.
You're originally from Winnipeg, as most people know.
Yes.
Before you left the city for Chicago, was there any kind of comedy scene around here at that time?
No.
Not at all?
No, because that was the 50s, and that was the folk singing period. In other words, there was always popular music. I'm trying to think of, probably Elvis not quite starting, but always hitting Winnipeg a little bit late. When I left, there was no television in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
It was all radio stuff. I think the same station, CKY, was there, and I can't quite remember the others, but I remember CKY being around. And where the Winnipeg Inn, I do remember there was a theater called the Dominion Theater, and they had a live radio show where they had sort of like, I guess what now would be called country western music, outlaw maybe.
Okay.
That was the style. That was very popular in Winnipeg. And folk music. No, there was no comedy scene. I don't remember ever hearing of a comedian coming to Winnipeg in my adolescence or anything like that. No.
And then when you left, you didn't actually, as far as I've heard and read, you didn't actually leave to pursue comedy. You left for school.
Yeah, I went to school. I went to theological school. Eventually got a scholarship to Israel University, and I was there for a while. I had no plan really, but Chicago was an incredible place to get to. And then when I got to the University of Chicago, and I was around, I'd come back from Israel, then I'd be about 18 or 19 at the University of Chicago, and in Chicago, blues was happening, right around the University of Chicago area, where you could see Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, all these sort of legendary blues guys who were playing to 6 and 8 and 10 people.
Oh, wow.
And I would be there every night. So it was like our small group of misfits that we were considered at that time. And then there was a club in Chicago called the Gate of Horn, and they had folk music, which I was interested in because that was the going thing at the time. The Weavers, Pete Seeger, everything that was called lefty music was appealing to me. And then at the Gate of Horn, that's when I saw Lenny Bruce, and it was the first comedian I ever saw. And that was amazing.
Yeah, and then from that moment on, you pretty much were drawn to that?
I was drawn to it, but I had no way of knowing how to do it and how to get to it. And
right.
Like you say, you just love that. It doesn't mean that you want to do it. In this day and age, there isn't a family around us here in Los Angeles that doesn't have a child or a grandchild or someone who wants to be in show business. In those days, especially being a comedian or being in comedy, that was considered a weird thing to do, not a way in which to make a living. That's for sure. So no, I wasn't. I just couldn't get over how brilliant he was, and I was just drawn to entertainment in a very, very big way. And I'd been on stage a lot. I was always talking to large groups at this high school I went to, which was an Orthodox high school, co-ed high school in Chicago. I got written in as the president, but only because I was on stage all the time, just making fun of everything that was going on, never having seen a comedian.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize. I only realized in retrospect that there was a path that I was actually on without knowing it. And then at the University of Chicago, Second City came through. Second City had just been formed, and they performed at a place called Mandel Hall, one of the places there. I snuck in to see them, and that was it. And then I said, okay, I know how to do this. I'm not as good as those people, but I have the same information. That was it. Then I was after it. then that was the start of wanting to do it.
Mm-hmm. And who was around Second City at that time? I've heard some names mentioned that were there at the time you were.
Well, the people who were around that I followed were Alan Arkin and Barbara Harris, not names that are very well known, but known in Second City circles.
Yeah,
Mike Nichols and Elaine May, Shelley Berman at the time. It was a ridiculously brilliant group of people on stage at the same time, and irreverent, and dealing with a strong political point of view that you could in those days really get in trouble for. And in some ways later on I did. But I just felt I could do it, and I got into the company. And the moment I hit the stage, I just realized I'm good at something. I up until that time, I didn't know what it was going to be.
Yeah. Now I want to talk a little bit about your time appearing on The Tonight Show over the years. I've heard numbers bantered about how many appearances you actually had. Second most to Bob Hope, I think.
Yeah.
Do you know the actual number?
Well, the number is somewhere between, because of the documentary on The Tonight Show that's coming out, a very extensive one for PBS here, and I'm interviewed a lot. They interviewed everyone. Somewhere, it was like between 138 or 140 appearances, because I started with Johnny in the 60s, in like 68, and I was still doing the show the last week when he retired, which I think was like 93 or something like that. So I was on a lot, and because of my Second City background, he could call me in the last minute to fill in. I mean, the reason I was booked all the time, because we had a good rapport, so I was on almost every 7 weeks or something like that. And it was sort of like an op-ed page for me. But the reason I was on so much is that he could call me in the last minute and I would be okay with not having had to prepare anything.
Right.
And Bob Newhart was another person who did it as much as I did. Not quite as much, but he was also someone that you could call in the last minute.
Now, what was your relationship like with Johnny?
We were good friends. He was a mentor. He mentored me almost my whole career. He guided me. There are a number of ways to bond in show business. Mm-hmm. To me, the best way to bond is if you both hate the same people. So we hated the same people. I'm using hate a little comedically, but
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, we knew who was full of shit, who wasn't. That guy, he might be a big star, but he's full of shit. He's not the real deal and all that. Uh-huh. So we were just friends. We would, I wrote a lot for him when he would do special events. I would write stuff for him, and we were together. I know all of his wives. I went through all of them with him, and his nephew Jeff, who runs the Carson estate, is still a very good friend of mine because I know him I knew him before he even got close to Johnny. So yeah, we started in the 60s, and my second appearance on the Tonight Show, I was like 26, 27. I'm not even sure what my age was. I was in my 20s, and he said, it's hard for me to do these shows. I'm going to start taking off on Monday. Do you want to host the show? And, this is the only answer you could come up when you're young like that. And, oh, sure. Yeah, like I really deserved it and could do it.
Yeah.
But I started hosting it. I hosted it quite a bit. And sort of that background has sort of reared itself now with the show. I've got a kind of, I don't know how to say popular, but at least a critically well-received show that's on now where I've been interviewing comedians called Inside Comedy. It's on Showtime.
How did the idea for the Inside Comedy series first come about?
Well, Steve Carell and I were talking, and he said, you span so many decades of comedy because of directing. I've been doing this a long time, And he said, why don't we sort of document where everyone is in comedy right now, not just stand-up comedians, but just comedy in general. Mm-hmm. And we started to do it as a film. And I raised the money, and we were just doing a film, and to our surprise, everybody said yes. I mean, at the highest level, they said yes, and we took people that we love. And the show, what's interesting about the show, when you see it, it's two people together. They're not together, but how it goes back and forth between the one and the other, like Seinfeld and Rickles are a show, and it's what's similar about them, how they talk about each other. It's a very unique. It's a little hard to describe because it's so unique, but it's one of my favorite things that I've done, actually.
Out of all the people that you interviewed for this series, are there any favorites that stand out?
There aren't favorites, but some shows, like the Seinfeld Rickles show, is sort of an interesting show. I know that Showtime wanted to submit that for an Emmy, so obviously people feel that way. Mm-hmm. But Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner is a remarkable show. Robin Williams and Jonathan Winter. Chris Rock is all by himself. He's great. I mean, it's hard to single one out over the other. They're totally eclectic, and yet the response to it has been just amazing, really exciting. I expected people to like it. I didn't expect them to find it different, and that's what they seem to be doing.
Well, I think it seems over the last few years, the idea of really getting into the history and process behind comedy has come to the forefront. So I think you're tackling it in a slightly different way, but still kind of bringing that like behind-the-scenes look into comedy that people are looking for these days.
Yeah, and you know what, Paul, the interesting thing about it is comedians talk to another comedian very differently than they talk to anybody else. So it doesn't have that sort of, I don't know what it would be in the CBC sort of documentary, researched feel to it. It has a spontaneous sharing of stories and information, and that's what people are liking about it.
Now, you've been involved with so many iconic television shows over the years, from Smothers Brothers, obviously we touched on The Tonight Show, Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yes.
So very few have actually worked on so many shows for as long as you have, but were there ever any points in your career throughout that where you still weren't quite sure if the next project would come along?
Well, that's a very good question, because when people, what the internet has done for my career has been remarkable, because when I would go meet with people, I wouldn't tell them everything that I had done. So I started to notice in the 90s when I'd go into meetings, people would be a lot more respectful than they were up until then. They would be nice, but now I found them more, because they had my whole history in front of them. And that history has been incredible. But the truth of it is if you look at any long career, I only know mine, but if you look at it and all these sort of people that I apprentice on the shows who want to direct that I'll keep with me, or, show them what I'm doing, they keep on talking about, just look at this wonderful career. And I keep on saying, it's about the failures. I've had more failures than anybody. That's really the truth. If you have as many successful shows as I have, it's because you've come back from shows that have just fallen by the wayside. There's so many times I didn't know I was going to get another job, and there's so many times when I was out of work, and so many times, and when I became a director, I had to convince people, because I was a very well-known comedian. Mm-hmm. They said, well, why would you want to be doing this? And when I wanted to direct, I did a movie that's sort of now being reintroduced. At the time, it wasn't very successful, with Burt Reynolds, called Paternity. Now it's sort of a well looked upon first film. Mm-hmm. But I did have a career. It was offered to me to do more movies, but I was interested in television. In the early 80s, television was still called the idiot box, and it wasn't something that anyone would think of as a career. To direct on television shows was almost like not being a director. The only prestige was really doing movies. Yeah. And I was interested in sitcoms, and I got into it right away. And I still have the Tonight shows, because Johnny was still there for another 10 or 11, 12 years. Mm-hmm. So I could direct and still be on the Tonight Show. So one really enhanced the other. I always had a presence, so, when people were thinking of me for comedies, they, saw me on the air, say, okay, well, this guy's funny, he'd be right for this, and it helped. But tons of shows didn't work. And that Matt Perry's a friend of mine, and he's now doing a pilot for another show. And I guess I was reading the state. I think they're somewhere where they're talking to all the Friends stars.
Yeah,
everyone who was in Friends, and just what it was like before they got Friends, and what it was like after. And Matt Perry said, "Well, I was doing the lamest pilot of all time. It was about a future LAX airport." And he talked about how lame it was. And he and I had just talked about that a week before. I'm going to kill him because I directed that pilot. So I was actually, my next call is to Matt anyway, because it was in the paper today. He didn't mention me, but he just mentioned it was the worst show that he's ever done. It was pretty bad. But there are a lot of those, and really it's how you come back from failure, because show business is not easy. No business is easy to get into the thin air if you're lucky enough to get there. You need luck. You need a lot of luck, but you need to be able to come back from things failing, and you need to fail big, because when you're trying to do bigger things, you're going to fail harder, and then every once in a while one of those things goes through and you find yourself you're in a good position.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to just ask you, because you've worked with him quite a lot through both Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm, what Larry David is like to work with.
Well, we're very good friends, and we have been since the 80s. Larry is very first of all, he's not that character.
Right.
He is improvising on the character, sort of making fun of himself. But he's a good collaborator. He knows what he wants. He knows what is wrong all the time.
Yeah. And
in comedy, you don't really know what's right until you poke around. And again, it's still a process of failing. Okay, that's what we want to do. And just you put in a lot of time. Larry would only describe himself one way, as a writer.
Yeah.
And he's probably in my experience, the best comedy writer I've ever worked with. And I think a lot of people would acknowledge that even without having worked with him. But when you work with him, he's a hard worker. One of the sort of a myth that people have about Seinfeld, now that they see Larry and Curb Your Enthusiasm, is that Seinfeld didn't really write Seinfeld. He didn't write the show, just Larry did.
Yeah.
But it's not true. Jerry was an exceptional writer. Usually, the star of the show has to be a good writer. And Larry was brilliant, but Jerry wrote with him. When I would leave the lot, at Seinfeld, it would be late at night, midnight, because you'd be writing late, and there'd just be two cars there after all the writers had gone and everyone had gone, and that would just be Larry David and Seinfeld's car there, and they just worked harder than anybody else. But like Paul Reiser, who I worked with on Mad About You, which I did for years, and Paul Reiser was also just an exceptional writer. And I think one of the lucky things for me is that I was sort of because I had my comedy background, I was always someone that everyone wanted in the writer's room as much as wanted me to direct. Because directing television comedies is not like directing a film. There's a formula that you fall into, but it is about finding the humor and just getting the distance right from the actors and the camera and stuff like that.
I want to ask you a little bit about the first Winnipeg Comedy Festival. I was interviewing Al Ray a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that when he first kind of came up with the idea for it, he was working with you in Vancouver, I believe, on a project.
Yes.
And you kind of were integral in getting some of the money behind getting the first Winnipeg Comedy Festival started. Yeah,
well, Al Ray is a friend of mine, Bruce Clark, Jeff Rothstead, we all worked together on Big Sound, and Al said to me, if you would agree to do this, that it would help us, talk with, I think it was the CBC at the time, I don't even remember, it would matter, and I thought, well, I didn't know I had that clout, but if I can make that happen, I will, so that was the reason I did it.
What can people expect from your show or your appearance at the Chosen Ones show at the Winnipeg Comedy Festival?
Well, for me to be delving into Jewish humor in terms of material is redundant. I mean, it's going to seem like I'm pandering to an audience when I've been doing this my whole career. I was, you know, one of the reasons I had a success in the States with what I was doing is that I was not like the other Jewish comedians who were really good. I mean, they're like amazing, funny, Buddy Hackett. Those guys are great.
Yeah.
But I was not self-deprecating about Jewish. I was like militantly Jewish. And I was deprecating about non-Jews. So it was Gentiles who were funny. Goyim were funny. So that was my approach. So the sad thing about this show that I'm doing now is people are going to think that I'm condescending to them by doing what I've always done, but I'll just do the same thing I've always done in the areas of Jewish stuff. But it's taking a strong approach towards your Jewishness and sort of attacking in some way. So I don't know. We'll figure out. It reminds me, given that I'm in Winnipeg, I might even try and remember some of the stuff that related to Winnipeg. That was the first material I did on the Tonight Show, and maybe bring that up a little bit. Yeah,
that would be interesting, and then see maybe for the locals, see how much things have changed in Winnipeg, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, living in the States and spending most of your time down there, but over the last couple of years, Winnipeg has kind of had a comedy renaissance, a bit of a burgeoning scene here, to the point where there are a really good number of solid young comics working regularly.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I think it's incredible. I think it's great.
What do you think it is about a place like Winnipeg or Canada in general that seems to breed comedy?
Well, let's talk about like the SCTV group. That was a group that I worked with on my Canadian show, the David Steinberg show.
Yeah.
And people keep on saying, well, how come all these great people are from Canada, great comedians, in fact? And I don't think the theory applies as much today, but at that time, Canada, you got the culture from the States seeping through to Canada all the time.
Yeah.
So you have an outsider's view of what's going on in the culture, and then because you're good at it, you sort of, and if you get known like Marty Short and Catherine O'Hara, then you have this insider's view, and an inside view and an outside view is valuable for comedy. In other words, you can't be a good stand-up comedian if you're not slightly an outsider about something.
Yeah.
And so in Winnipeg, you're an outsider automatically by being in Winnipeg, just by where you are geographically.
Uh-huh.
And, even when I've shot shows in Canada and, I did Living in Your Car with and Big Sound with those guys and everything, the crews, when I find someone from Winnipeg, they're just, first of all, people all they do is joke about the weather in Winnipeg.
Uh-huh.
But the personalities are what make Winnipeg interesting, and it must be just sort of the ethnic breakdown that some of there isn't that ethnic pressure to assimilate too much. In the States, you have that more than you have that in Canada, and I think you have that even less in Winnipeg for some reason.
Yeah.
I think somewhere in there, a sociologist could find the answer to your question.
Yeah, and I think it's something that's interesting about the Winnipeg scene that you may not find in other scenes, from what I've gathered, is there's a lot of support from everyone. It doesn't feel cutthroat like a lot of other cities.
No, that is true, and it must be, and it's in me as a sort of a Winnipeg person that what people like about the show, that Inside Comedy show, is that it has a warmth to it. It's not about the bitter comedians and how played the toilets. It's none of that. It's the opposite, and yeah, there's something like that is accurate.
ShowbizMonkeys.com